We now begin the second half of Unit 7, where the focus is on probability. It is included in the data analysis unit because probability often involves the collection or analysis of data. In Lesson 1 of Section 3, we will review converting between ratios, fractions, decimals, and percent, and then begin our introduction to probability. To help us review the idea of converting between the various forms of ratio, fraction, percent, and decimal, let's complete the following table. And the importance of this activity, I should add, is that quite often probabilities are expressed in one of these four forms, either as a ratio, a fraction, a percent, or a decimal. In this table, I will give you either a ratio, a fraction, a percent, or a decimal, and our task will be to convert it to the other three forms. In our first example, we have the fraction 1/2, which is simplest form. I can easily convert that to a ratio. My numerator becomes the first term of my ratio. I often use the colon to express a ratio, and the denominator becomes the second term in the ratio. And we read it as 1 to 2. The first 2 is a TO, the second 2 is a TWO. How now do we convert the fraction 1/2 to a percent? And you may know immediately what the answer is here. The strategy that we often introduce, if we want a percent or a percent, and C-E-N-T, those four letters in French mean 100. So what we have is per 100. If I want to rewrite 1/2 as a fraction out of 100, that will in turn give me my percentage. We are writing an equivalent fraction here. 2 times 50 will give me 100. To write the equivalent fraction, 1 times 50 is 50. And as I suspect you already knew, that in turn gives us 50 per 100, 50%. To convert 1/2 to a decimal, again, I'm going to look at the fraction, the equivalent fraction that we just created. If we read that, that's 50 hundredths. So as a decimal, 0 and 50 hundredths. Or, of course, you could also write 0 and 5/10. This last 0 doesn't need to be there, but I would accept either form. Let's look at our second example. This time we have a percentage given, 25%. This too is a common percentage, and you may know all of your answers here pretty quickly, but let's go through the process. If I have 25%, I'm going to go right to my fraction first, because 25%, 25 per 100. That is a fraction, but it is not simplest form. So we are going to reduce this fraction. I can divide numerator and denominator by 25 nicely. 25 divided by itself is 1, and 100 divided by 25 is 4, giving us the fraction 1/4. With the fraction in simplest form, I immediately go to my ratio, 1, 2, 4. For my decimal, I'm going to look at my fraction again out of 100, 25 hundredths. My decimal, 0 and 25 hundredths. A common way as well of converting a percent to a decimal is if we look at our percentage, to move your decimal point 2 places to the left. That's okay too. Our third example, we've been given the ratio this time, 4 to 5. And that ratio is in simplest form. This time I'm going to pop right to my fraction. 4 to 5 will mean 4/5. To get my percent, I'm going to take this fraction in simplest form, see if I can write it out of 100. And I can. 5 times 20 is 100. 4 times 20 is 80. 80 per 100 gives me 80%. As a decimal, 80 hundredths will become 0 and 80 hundredths, or I could write that as 0 and 8/10, 0.8. Now we have a decimal. If I read that decimal, 0 and 9/10, the 9 is in the tenths place. If I have 0 and 9/10, that gives me my fraction, 9/10. If I have my fraction and that is in simplest form, I can go right to my ratio, 9 to 10. If I want my percentage, I'm going to write my fraction out of 100. 10 times 10 is 100. 9 times 10 is 90. Therefore, we have 90%. I could also have gone to my decimal, and instead of moving my decimal point 2 places to the left, I go 2 places to the right, and that in turn would give me 90% as well. And our last example is probably the hardest one here. You have been given a fraction again, 4 over 6. The first thing you need to notice about this particular fraction, though, is that it's not in simplest form. We will write it in simplest form. What number will go into 4 and 6 nicely? 2. 2 is the GCF for 4 and 6. 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Our fraction in simplest form is 2/3. With a fraction in simplest form, ratio is easy to get, 2 to 3. Now we run into a little bit of a problem because 2 over 3 is not a fraction that we can easily rewrite as something out of 100. 3 times nothing nice gives us 100. So how are we going to get our decimal and our percentage here? If we're not going to use our calculator, which would be a very efficient way to get our answer, we could then use long division. And to do that, I'm going to take my denominator, 3, divide into my numerator, 2, and I'm going to put in some zeros. 3 cannot divide into 2, so I put a 0, line up my decimal. 3 will go into 20, 6 times, gives me 18. Subtract, I get a 2. Bring down my next 0. 3 into 20, 6 times. 3 times 6 is 18. Subtract, I get a 2. And very quickly you see the pattern that exists here. We will continually get another 6 with a 2 remainder. That then gives us a decimal of 0.6, and we put a bar over the 6 to indicate that it's repeating. This is what we call a repeating decimal. To get the percentage then, if I move my decimal point 2 places to the right, and if I do not round, I would write it as 66.6 with a bar over that particular 6%. If we were to round to the nearest percentage, we would say approximately 67%. Please keep in mind, as you proceed through the next few videos and activities, that any ratios or fractions you always express in simplest form, and please, too, write your answers as requested. If it asks for a fraction, if it asks for a ratio, make sure you express your answer accordingly. And now I'd like you to proceed to the next video in this lesson, where we really begin our study of probability.